I opened the front door and froze. Boxes. Stacked in towers across my living room floor. Clothes draped over my couch. A framed portrait of Beatrice, my mother-in-law, leaning against the wall where my bookshelf had always stood. She was pulling dishes from a cardboard box, setting them on my kitchen counter like she was arranging her own home. Because in her mind, she already was. Laura leaned against the doorframe between the kitchen and living room, arms folded, watching me with that calm, infuriating smile she only wore when she felt completely untouchable. "Nathan," she said, her voice smooth and measured, the way a person speaks when they've rehearsed the moment. "You can accept her living here." She paused just long enough. "Or you can leave." The words landed like cold water. My hands tightened around the doorframe. My jaw locked. I didn't shout. I didn't slam anything. I just stood there while the betrayal settled into my chest, metallic and bitter, like swallowing a coin. "My name is Nathan Hale. I'm 34 years old, a project manager at an architecture firm, and until that exact moment, I had believed, genuinely believed, that my marriage was a partnership built on mutual respect. I was wrong. 6 months earlier, none of this felt possible. Laura and I had been married 3 years. We weren't perfect, but we communicated. We solved problems together. At least, that was what I thought. The first warning came quietly, the way all dangerous things do. We were redesigning the back garden, replacing the old paving with raised flower beds and a small seating area. I had a clear vision, sketched out and priced. Then Laura suggested we run it by her mother first. I thought she meant a quick phone call. Instead, Beatrice arrived that same weekend with printed opinions and strong coffee, walking the garden like a surveyor assessing land she intended to purchase. She questioned every decision I'd made. The placement of the flower beds was too symmetrical. My choice of stone was cold and masculine. My seating arrangement would block the light. I smiled through all of it, mostly because I didn't think it mattered. She was just visiting. She would go home eventually. But Laura watched her mother dismantle my plans with quiet appreciation, nodding along, offering no defense of my choices. Not once. I dismissed the discomfort afterward, telling myself it was a harmless visit, just harmless advice from a strong-willed woman. Looking back now, it was the first brick in a very deliberate wall. The erosion was gradual. That's the thing about slow manipulation. It doesn't arrive with a warning. It seeps in through the cracks of ordinary life until you barely recognize your own home. Dinner conversations changed first. My opinions on work, on finances, on weekend plans, all began attracting small, quiet dismissals from Laura. A raised eyebrow. A slight laugh. That's interesting, but actually. That was never followed by anything particularly more interesting. Beatrice visited more frequently after the garden incident. Every second weekend, then every weekend. She always had a reason, dropping off food, helping with laundry, just passing by. Each time, something shifted slightly. A lampshade replaced. A rug moved. My collection of architecture books relocated from the living room shelf to a box in the hallway. When I mentioned the books, Laura said I was overreacting. When I mentioned the lampshade, she called it an upgrade. Each incident alone was small enough to dismiss. A reasonable person could explain any one of them away. But I was a project manager. I spent my working life tracking details, spotting patterns, identifying where small deviations compound into larger problems. And the pattern here was unmistakable. I was being quietly, methodically pushed to the edges of my own home. The question I hadn't yet answered was whether Laura was aware of it, or actively directing it. The answer came on a Tuesday evening, 7 days before the boxes appeared. We were eating dinner. Pasta Laura had cooked, which should have been pleasant, when she said it. Offhandedly. Almost too casually. The way a person drops something heavy and pretends it weighs nothing. "You know," she said, twirling her fork. "Mom's been struggling with the stairs at her place. I keep thinking, she might just move in permanently someday." I looked up. She didn't look back. She kept eating. I laughed, a short, uncomfortable sound. "That's quite the plan," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "It's just a thought," she replied, shrugging. I didn't push it. I should have. Instead, I let the moment pass, and in doing so, I handed her the confidence to move forward. Because that conversation wasn't a casual musing. It was a test. She was checking my temperature, measuring how I'd react. And my nervous laugh told her everything she needed to know, that I could be managed, that I would choose comfort over confrontation, and that when the real moment arrived, I would be too slow to respond. She was right about most of that, but not all of it. The night of the boxes, After Laura had gone upstairs and Beatrice had settled into what used to be our guest room, I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. I stayed there for 2 hours. I wasn't emailing anyone. I wasn't searching the internet aimlessly. I was reading. Carefully, methodically, the way I read project contracts at work, looking for terms, clauses, rights, and responsibilities. I pulled up every document I had saved in the folder I'd labeled House, Admin. Mortgage agreements. Insurance records. The title deed. My pulse steadied as I read. The house had been purchased 4 years ago, 1 year before Laura and I married. The deposit had come entirely from savings I'd accumulated over 6 years of working. The mortgage was in my name alone. Laura had contributed nothing to the purchase, not the deposit, not the legal fees, not a single monthly payment. We had discussed, early in our marriage, adding her to the deed someday. But we had never done it. Life had moved on. The conversation had never returned. Which meant, legally and entirely, the house belonged to me. I closed the laptop. I sat in the quiet. I didn't feel powerful yet. I felt sad, and tired, and quietly furious. But underneath all of that, I felt something else taking shape. Clarity. I didn't call Mark that night. I waited. Mark Osei was a property solicitor and one of my oldest friends. The kind of friend who tells you hard truths without softening them unnecessarily. We'd known each other since university, and over the years he'd helped me understand more about property law than I ever expected to need. I called him 2 days later, on my lunch break, away from the office and from Laura's earshot. I kept the conversation general at first. Hypothetically, I said, if someone owns a property outright before marriage, what are the legal implications if the marriage breaks down? Mark asked a few questions. I answered carefully. By the end of the call, he had confirmed what I already suspected. Because the house was purchased solely in my name, with funds I had saved before the marriage, and because Laura had never been added to the deed or mortgage, my ownership was legally clear and well documented. Keep all your records in order, he told me. Receipts, bank statements, the original deed. Don't move anything, don't sign anything, and don't have any big financial conversations without telling me first. I thanked him and hung up. Back inside, Laura was sending emails from the kitchen table. Beatrice was watching television in the living room, shoes off, feet up on my coffee table. I smiled pleasantly at both of them. I was beginning to understand the value of patience. I made a decision in those early days that changed everything. I would stop reacting and start observing. Every time Laura dismissed my opinion, I noted it, mentally, and sometimes in a small notebook I kept in my desk drawer at work. Every time Beatrice rearranged something, moved something, claimed something, I photographed it quietly with my phone. Timestamps intact. This wasn't paranoia. It was documentation. And documentation, I knew from years of project management, is the difference between losing an argument and winning it. Laura read my silence as defeat. She became more relaxed, more open in her assumptions. She started referring to our renovation plans for the spare room, meaning her and Beatrice's plans. She started leaving Beatrice alone in the house when she went to work, which hadn't been discussed or agreed upon. One evening, Laura made a comment at dinner, something about my sensitivity to change, and laughed. Beatrice smiled along. I looked at my plate and said nothing. But I noted the time, the words, the tone. I was giving them rope. Not to hurt them, but because arrogant people, given enough space, always tell you exactly what they think. And what they think always becomes evidence. By the third week, Beatrice had made herself completely comfortable. She rearranged the bookshelf in the hallway, removing my architecture books entirely and replacing them with decorative baskets. She reorganized the kitchen cupboards so her preferred dishes were at the front. She placed a small religious figurine on the mantelpiece above the fireplace without asking. Each time, I photographed it. I created a folder on my phone, House Changes, dated. Every image had a timestamp. Every change was catalogued. I also began keeping a log in my notebook, date, description of what was moved or said, who was present. It felt clinical at first, almost strange, treating my own home like a project site. But it grounded me. It reminded me that I was not imagining things, that the evidence was real and accumulating. Laura saw me writing in the notebook once and asked what I was working on. Project notes, I said, which wasn't entirely untrue. She nodded and went back to her phone. She didn't ask again. The thing about people who assume they're in control is that they stop paying attention to the person they've underestimated. Laura had written me off as manageable. That confidence was the crack I intended to walk through. On a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the boxes arrived, I found a quiet moment alone with Laura in the kitchen. Beatrice had gone out briefly. The house was still. I poured 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of Laura, sat down across from her. I need to ask you something, I said. My voice was calm, deliberately, carefully calm. Was the ultimatum real? Accept your mother living here, or leave. Laura looked up from her phone. Something passed across her face. Not quite guilt, more like recalibration. She had expected an argument, not a quiet question. Nathan, she said, with a small, patient exhale, we've been through this. We haven't actually, I said. You made a statement. I didn't respond. I'm responding now. She set her phone down. Mom needs support. This is the practical solution. I'd hoped you would come around by now. And if I don't come around? She held my gaze steadily. Then we have a bigger problem. She said it without heat, without cruelty, just the flat certainty of someone who believed the outcome was already settled. I nodded slowly. Thank you for being honest. She blinked, clearly expecting more. When nothing came, she picked up her phone again. She thought she had won that conversation. She hadn't realized it was an interrogation. 2 days later, I sat across from Mark at a coffee shop 2 streets from my office. I laid everything out, the timeline, the documents, the photographs, the notebook entries. Mark listened without interrupting, which was how I knew he was taking it seriously. When I finished, he leaned back and was quiet for a moment. The ownership is completely clean, he said. The house is yours, Nathan. There's no legal ambiguity here. Laura has no claim to the property. I asked about rights if she challenged it. He walked me through it methodically. Because the deposit had come from premarital savings, because the mortgage was in my name only, because Laura had never been formally added to the deed, and because there was no record of her contributing to mortgage payments, the legal position was straightforward. Her name isn't on anything, he said. Not the deed, not the mortgage, not a single payment record. I felt the information settle. Not with triumph, but with relief. The kind of relief that comes when you confirm that you are not, in fact, going mad. I asked Mark what I should do next. Nothing dramatic, he said. Keep your records organized. Don't tip your hand prematurely. And call me before you make any major move. I paid for the coffee, thanked him, and walked back to the office. I chose a Friday evening for what I privately called the first signal. I invited 2 friends, my colleague Priya and an old university friend, Dominic, for dinner. Laura was present. Beatrice joined us for dessert, which I'd quietly expected. The conversation moved naturally through work, news, the usual comfortable noise of people who know each other reasonably well. At one point, Dominic asked casually how I found owning a house in the current market. He was considering buying and wanted perspectives. It's a real anchor, I said honestly, especially when you own it outright. There's a security to having your name on the deed that nothing really replaces. I said it lightly, conversationally, without looking at Laura. But I saw it, the slight stiffening of her posture. The way Beatrice's hand paused mid-reach for her tea. Priya nodded, asking follow-up questions about mortgage rates. I answered them naturally, casually, still without directing anything toward Laura. But the information had landed. I watched Laura recover her composure smoothly. She smiled, redirected the conversation, refilled drinks. She was good at recovery. I'd always known that. But Beatrice's smile, for the first time since moving in, carried a faint uncertainty behind it. The seed had been planted. After that dinner, I paid closer attention to their patterns. Beatrice, I had realized early on, was not the architect of this situation. She was a beneficiary. The plan had been Laura's. Beatrice simply occupied the space her daughter cleared for her. Laura operated through assumption. She assumed I would accommodate. She assumed I lacked the nerve for confrontation. She assumed that love, or the memory of it, would keep me compliant. She also assumed that the house was, in any meaningful sense, as much hers as mine. That assumption was the foundation her entire strategy rested on. I started anticipating her moves the way I tracked project risks at work, identifying likely next steps, preparing responses, keeping my own intentions opaque. When she was pleasant, I was pleasant. When she was dismissive, I absorbed it quietly and noted it. I became, outwardly, the picture of a man slowly adjusting. Inwardly, I was building a case file. Every passive-aggressive comment added to it. Every decision made without consulting me. Every piece of furniture moved without discussion. Every meal where my preferences were ignored. All of it entered the record. Laura thought she was watching me adapt. She was actually watching me prepare. It was a Wednesday evening when Laura escalated. We were sitting in the living room after dinner, Beatrice had gone to her room, and Laura said it casually, the way she delivered most important things. "I've been thinking," she said, "that since you're not fully on board with the arrangement, I'll start managing the household bills separately, from my own account, just to keep things clear." I looked at her steadily. "What do you mean by separately?" "I mean I'll handle what affects me and Mom. You can handle your portion." The suggestion was absurd on its surface. We were married, living in my house. But underneath the absurdity was a message. She was beginning to divide the territory. She was telling me, without saying it directly, that she and Beatrice were a unit now, and that I was the one who needed to decide which side of the line I stood on. I kept my expression neutral. "I'll think about it," I said. She looked pleased, as though the conversation had gone exactly as intended. I didn't think about it. I called Mark the following morning and told him what she'd said. He told me to document it. I already had. Mark's next suggestion was deliberate and precise. He drafted a short formal letter, nothing threatening, nothing aggressive, simply restating the property ownership facts and noting that any changes to the household arrangement, including the addition of a long-term resident, required the property owner's explicit consent. It was addressed to Laura. He walked me through it carefully, explaining that its purpose was not to provoke but to establish a legal paper trail. If things progressed further, the letter would show that she had been formally informed of the ownership situation. I had it delivered to the house. Laura received it on a Thursday afternoon. I was at work. She called me within 20 minutes, her voice controlled but with an edge I hadn't heard before. "What is this?" she asked. "A letter from my solicitor," I said. "Just making sure we're all clear on certain things." A pause. "This is unnecessary, Nathan." "I hope so," I said pleasantly. She hung up before I did. That evening, she was quieter than usual. Beatrice watched me across the dinner table with an expression that had lost its confidence. The letter had reached them. They had begun, for the first time, to take me seriously. The following Sunday, Laura organized a family brunch. Her sister, Vivian, came. An aunt named Phyllis, who had always been fond of Laura, arrived with her husband. Two neighbors Laura was friendly with filled out the table. Beatrice presided over it with the ease of a woman hosting in her own home. She directed where people sat, approved of the food layout, and at one point physically rearranged chairs around the garden table without asking anyone. I stood at the edge of the garden, coffee in hand, and photographed it. Not secretly. I held the phone up plainly, as though checking a message. But the camera captured it, the timestamp, the arrangement, the expression on Beatrice's face. Vivian, who had always been sharper than Laura gave her credit for, caught me doing it and raised an eyebrow. I smiled calmly and came to sit beside her. "You seem relaxed today," she said quietly. "I'm getting there," I replied. She studied me for a moment. "Laura said you've been difficult about the living situation." "Laura says a lot of things," I said, keeping my voice pleasant. Vivian looked toward her sister, then back at me. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite suspicion of Laura, but a small departure from certainty. I didn't push it. I didn't need to yet. I had arranged, 3 weeks earlier, for a contractor friend named Aid to come and give me a quote on a bathroom renovation. A project I'd been considering for 2 years and had now decided to actually begin. The timing was deliberate. Aid arrived on a Tuesday morning while Laura was working from home. He walked through the house, took measurements, made notes, and spoke only to me. Every question about preferences, budget, and timeline was directed at me. Because I'd briefed him in advance, he also made one small, deliberate move. When Laura approached with her own suggestion about the tiles, Aid listened politely and then turned back to me. "Whatever you decide, Nathan, it's your house, so your call." It was 4 words, "It's your house." Laura's expression flickered, a small tightening around the eyes. She excused herself shortly after and went upstairs. Beatrice, who had been hovering near the kitchen doorway, retreated to her room. I walked Aid out and thanked him. "Everything all right there?" he asked quietly at the door. "Getting better," I said. It was the first time I'd believed that fully. The contractor's casual confirmation, witnessed by both of them, completely unprompted, had done what no argument of mine could have done. That evening, Laura came downstairs and walked directly to where I was reading in the living room. She stood in front of me, arms folded, and I could tell from her posture that she had been composing this conversation for several hours. "What was that today?" she asked. "What was what?" "You briefed Aid. He was performing." I set down my book. Aid gave me a renovation quote. He asked me questions because I'm the client. "Don't treat me like I'm stupid, Nathan." "I'm not treating you any particular way," I said. I asked a contractor to quote a renovation on my house. Everything proceeded normally. She stared at me. The composure she usually maintained so effortlessly was fraying slightly. I could see it in her jaw, the slight unevenness of her breath. You need to stop doing this, she said. Doing what? She didn't answer immediately, because the honest answer, you need to stop reminding me that you own this house, was the one thing she couldn't say without admitting how much her entire strategy had depended on me forgetting it. She turned and went back upstairs. Beatrice appeared briefly in the doorway, looked at me, and retreated. The cracks were widening. 3 days later, Mark called me at work. I need you to look at something, he said. Did Laura recently try to change the utilities into her name? My stomach tightened. Not that I know of. Why? He had been alerted, through a contact at the relevant provider, that an application had been made to transfer the primary account holder on several household utilities. The application had been made in Laura's name. It hadn't been processed, because certain ownership verification steps had raised a flag. But it had been attempted. I sat very still at my desk for a moment. She hadn't mentioned it. She hadn't discussed it. She had simply tried, quietly and without my knowledge, to transfer control of the household utilities to her name, which would have given her the appearance of being the primary householder. Mark had already flagged it and blocked further processing. He advised me to add a security note to all accounts linked to the property. That evening, I came home and found Laura in the kitchen. Beatrice was seated at the table. I made tea, sat down, looked at Laura directly. I know, I said, simply. She met my eyes. Something behind hers broke and quickly reassembled. But I had seen it. The utility incident shifted something. I had been patient, methodical, private. I had documented without sharing, planned without announcing, waited without confronting. But now I understood that Laura wasn't going to stop testing boundaries because I remained composed. She was going to keep pushing until she met genuine resistance. I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Vivian, who had watched me carefully at the family brunch. I didn't say anything dramatic. I simply asked if she had time for coffee that week. She agreed. The second call was to my cousin Theo, a reliable, honest person who had known Laura and me since before our marriage. He had commented to me, months ago, that Laura seemed different lately, his words, unprompted. I met Vivian on a Thursday. I met Theo on a Saturday. With both of them, I was measured and honest. I didn't catastrophize or perform injury. I simply told them what had happened, showed them the documents I felt comfortable sharing, and let them draw their own conclusions. Both of them, independently, said the same thing, that they had noticed changes in Laura over the past year and had said nothing because they hadn't wanted to interfere. I thanked them and didn't ask them to act. I didn't need to. I just needed them to be paying attention when the moment came. The dinner where everything changed publicly happened on a Sunday afternoon. I had invited Vivian, Theo, and Phyllis over, family I trusted, people who had known us long enough to have context. I kept it informal, a casual lunch, nothing formal. Laura organized the food, which meant she felt in control of the setting. After the meal, while everyone sat over tea and coffee, I placed a document on the table. Not dramatically, not with a speech. I simply set it there, the way you'd set down a newspaper, and said, Vivian, you were asking about our living situation last time. I thought this might clarify things. It was a copy of the property deed. My name, clearly listed. The purchase date, 4 years ago, 1 year before the marriage. No other names. Vivian picked it up and read it. Phyllis leaned over to look. Theo had already seen it, but he watched Beatrice. The silence that followed was brief but complete. Beatrice's expression, that comfortable, settled authority she had worn since moving in, dissolved. Laura's face went through 3 separate emotions in about 4 seconds. This is a private document, Laura said finally. It's a public record, I replied. Anyone can request it. The table was quiet. That evening, after the guests had left, Beatrice went quietly to her room. Laura and I stood in the kitchen. She didn't shout. That wasn't her style, and by now I understood her style completely. She was a person who operated through composure, and even in this moment, she tried to maintain it. I want to talk about this properly, she said. So do I said. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had told me to accept her mother or leave. I let the memory of that moment sit between us. I own this house, Laura, I said. Not us. Not you. Me. I purchased it before we married, with money I saved before we met. Your name has never been on the deed and you have never contributed to the mortgage. She looked at the table. Your mother can't live here without my agreement. And I haven't agreed. I was told to accept it or leave, in my own house. I want you to understand how that landed. She was quiet for a long moment. I thought we were building something together, she said finally. So did I replied. But building something together means making decisions together. What happened here was something different. She didn't argue. She had no legal ground to argue on. And she knew it now, fully and completely. The week that followed was quieter than any in recent memory. Beatrice kept to her room more than she had in weeks. Laura moved around the house with a careful, subdued energy, still present, still composed, but stripped of the confidence that had defined her since the boxes arrived.
About a year after the trial, I was invited to speak at a professional development event for allied health practitioners. The topic was clinical documentation and its role in patient safety. I accepted because documentation had, in a real way, saved my life. I did not tell the personal story at the event. That was not the right setting. But I spoke about consistent, dated, unemotional record-keeping in a way that several attendees said had changed how they thought about their own work. One woman came up to me afterward. She was a nurse in her mid-40s with a careful manner and a direct way of looking at people that reminded me of Detective Howell. She said she had been keeping a notebook like the one I described, for a different reason, and hearing me speak had helped her trust what she had written. I asked if she was okay. She said she was working on it. I gave her Alton Marsh's card. I had started keeping a small supply because I had learned that situations like mine were not as rare as I had once wanted to believe. Driving home that evening, I felt something I can only describe as alignment, the sense that what had happened to me had been turned, finally, into something useful. I still attend family gatherings. Not at the Aldrich family home, not yet. That will take more time, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But Vera has come to our house twice in the past 6 months for dinner. Both times she arrived with flowers and stayed to help with dishes, and the conversation was careful and real in a way I respect. Patrice and I exchange messages occasionally. She is building her own life, and I think she will be fine. Warren is a good man navigating a complicated grief, and I believe in him. I kept the notebook, not on my bedside table anymore, in the cabinet in my home office, in a labeled folder with my other clinical files. I do not read it often, but I have not thrown it away because it represents something I want to hold on to. Not the fear, not the illness, not the long months of uncertainty. What I want to remember is this: I did not panic. I did not confront. I did not perform my distress for anyone's comfort. I observed. I documented. I waited until I was certain. Then I handed everything to the people whose job it was to act, and I let the process work. Not rage, not luck, preparation.